In the dark heart of the Holocaust, Auschwitz stood as hell on earth, a place where science turned into sadism and medicine into torture. This extermination camp, the most notorious of the Nazi death machinery, witnessed some of the most inhuman and atrocious experiments ever conceived. Here, amidst unimaginable pain and suffering, Nazi doctors like Josef Mengele perpetrated horrors that defy all understanding, using prisoners as mere guinea pigs to satisfy their twisted thirst for knowledge and insane racial ideology. Under the macabre command of the Angel of Death, Auschwitz became a nightmare laboratory. Mengele and his colleagues conducted barbaric experiments on twins, injecting them with chemicals, sewing them together, and dissecting them alive. Pregnant women and children underwent indescribable procedures aimed at confirming racial and pseudoscientific theories. The experiment rooms were abysses of agony, where the screams of victims were drowned out by the indifference of their executioners. Stripped of all humanity, prisoners became numbers in a grim equation of death and suffering. As Holocaust survivor Primo Levi once said, Auschwitz represents a denial of humanity. Join us in remembering and honoring the victims of Auschwitz, to keep alive the memory of those who suffered and died at the hands of hatred and intolerance. Welcome to Leonardo da Vinci's tales. The Gates of Hell, Auschwitz-Birkenau and the Angel of Death. On January 27, 1945, the Soviet army entered Auschwitz, the largest Nazi extermination center in occupied Poland. From 1940 to 1945, it is estimated that at least 1.3 million people were deported to this camp, and out of these, at least 1.1 million were killed. Despite the overwhelming loss of life, over 7,000 inmates survived and were liberated by the Soviet soldiers. These survivors, many of whom were sick and dying, had endured extreme suffering, including brutal experiments by one of the most infamous Nazi doctors, Josef Mengele. On May 30, 1943, Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz, where he served as a camp physician at Auschwitz. It is believed that Mengele himself sought this position to further his research. Auschwitz was the largest of the Auschwitz camps and functioned as a major extermination center for Jews from across Europe. Mengele also oversaw the so-called Gypsy family camp at Birkenau. From 1943, nearly 21,000 Romani men, women and children were detained there. When this camp was shut down on August 2, 1944, Mengele played a role in selecting 2,893 Romani inmates for execution in the gas chambers. Soon after, he was promoted to chief physician of the camp, and in November 1944 took up a position at the Birkenau hospital for the SS. When trains filled with Jews arrived at Birkenau, camp medical staff, including Mengele, selected some able-bodied adults for forced labor. Those not selected, including many children and older adults, were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Pregnant women, mothers with babies, and young children were particularly targeted upon arrival. Mengele's justification was grim. He claimed there were no provisions to care for children, no Jewish communities where they could be freed, and that it wouldn't be humane to separate them from their mothers during execution. Consequently, he sent both mother and child to the gas chambers together. Mengele was also rumored to have been involved with Irma Gress, a notorious guard known for her cruelty. His relationship with her reportedly ended when he discovered she was involved with Jewish prisoners, whom he considered racially inferior. Mengele's dark side extended into sexual brutality. He is reported to have ignored his duties to oversee the rape of Jewish women by camp officials, allegedly to observe and record their reactions for his perverse interests. At Auschwitz and other concentration camps, camp physicians regularly undertook selections in the infirmaries and barracks to identify prisoners who were injured, ill, or too weak to work. The SS employed various methods to eliminate these prisoners, including lethal injections and gassing. Mengele, who was frequently involved in such selections at Birkenau, earned the grim nickname Angel of Death from some prisoners. Gisela Perl, a Jewish gynecologist imprisoned there, recalled the fear and terror Mengele's visits caused among the inmates. "We feared these visits more than anything else, because we never knew whether we would be permitted to live. He was free to do whatever he pleased with us." During a typhus outbreak in the women's camp, Mengele took drastic and deadly measures. He ordered 600 Jewish women from one block to be sent to their deaths in the gas chambers. The block was then sanitized, and the women from the adjacent block were bathed, deloused, and given new clothing before moving into the cleaned block. This procedure was methodically repeated for each barrack during the outbreak. Similar measures were taken during outbreaks of scarlet fever and other diseases, with infected prisoners routinely sent to the gas chambers. After World War II, Mengele became well known for his actions at Auschwitz. This was largely due to the stories from doctors who worked under him and from prisoners who survived his medical experiments. These experiments were approved by the SS, who managed the concentration camps. Mengele was one of about 50 doctors at Auschwitz. He wasn't the top doctor, nor did he lead the other doctors there. Yet, his name became the most recognized among all the doctors at the camp. This was partly because Mengele often showed up at the ramp during the prisoner selections. Even when he wasn't directly involved in selecting prisoners, he would look for twins to use in his experiments and doctors to work in the Buchenwald infirmary. Auschwitz was not just a place where prisoners were used for experiments conducted at this camp and others. It was also a major site for a variety of human experiments. This was due to the large number of prisoners, around 1.3 million men, women and children from various national and ethnic backgrounds, who were sent there. Researchers seeking human subjects who met specific criteria often found it easier to find them at Auschwitz than at other camps. Mengele was among more than a dozen SS medical personnel who performed experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. These doctors viewed their assignments at Auschwitz as an exciting chance to further their research careers. However, the experiments they carried out often severely injured the victims or led to their deaths. Sometimes, death was even the intended result. These medical professionals did not obtain consent from the prisoners, nor did they inform them about the treatments or their potential effects. Obsession with race, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and Mengele's pursuit. Mengele's mentor, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, might have orchestrated Mengele's assignment to Auschwitz to support the research of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics. During his tenure at Auschwitz, Mengele collected and sent blood, body parts, organs, skeletons, and fetuses from Auschwitz prisoners to his colleagues in Germany. He actively collaborated on their research projects, using prisoners as subjects for various studies and experiments. Mengele conducted his own experiments on Auschwitz prisoners, hoping to publish the results and gain credentials for a university professorship. At Auschwitz, Mengele set up a research complex in several barracks and selected medical professionals from among the prisoners to be his staff. He managed to acquire modern instruments and equipment for his research and even established a pathology lab. Mengele's research, along with the studies he performed for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, focused on how genes develop into specific physical and mental traits. While this is an important and legitimate field of genetic research when done ethically, Mengele and his colleagues' work was corrupted by their belief in a pseudoscientific theory of race, fundamental to Nazi ideology. This theory falsely claimed that human races are genetically distinct and ranked them in a hierarchy, suggesting that inferior races were more likely to have negative traits than superior races. These supposed negative traits included not just physical and mental illnesses, but also socially unacceptable behaviors like vagrancy, prostitution, and criminality. According to this false theory, intermarriage between races would pass these negative traits to the superior races. Mengele was determined to identify specific physical and biochemical markers that could definitively categorize individuals into specific races. He and his colleagues believed that discovering such markers was crucial for maintaining the alleged racial superiority of the German people. For Mengele and his team, the significance of this research justified the use of harmful and even deadly experiments on people, specifically Auschwitz prisoners, whom they deemed racially inferior. The science of suffering, Mengele's experiments and their victims. Mengele primarily targeted two ethnic groups for his experiments, Roma and Jews. Both groups were of special interest to Nazi biomedical researchers because Nazi ideology branded them as subhuman and a threat to the German race. As a result, Nazi scientists did not believe that medical ethics applied to members of these groups. While Mengele was at Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 20,000 Roma were detained there, and hundreds of thousands of Jews were brought in by transport. This concentration of victims provided a unique opportunity that was not available anywhere else in the world: the ability to access many individuals from these groups in one place and to conduct experiments on them without restriction. Mengele reportedly told a colleague that failing to utilize Auschwitz for human experimentation would be a crime, given the opportunities it presented. Mengele not only chose Roma as subjects for his medical experiments, but also conducted an anthropological study of the Roma men, women, and children in the gypsy camp. During an outbreak of Noma, a severe gangrene of the mouth, among Roma children, he tasked prisoner physicians with studying the disease. Noma is a bacterial infection that primarily affects extremely malnourished children. Mengele, however, believed the Roma children at Auschwitz suffered from Noma due to their heredity rather than the camp's conditions. Several children afflicted with Noma were killed so that their heads and organs could be preserved and sent to the SS Medical Academy in Graz and other facilities for further study. Prisoner physicians eventually found a cure for Noma, but despite this, all the children who were cured were later murdered in the gas chambers. Mengele had a keen interest in identical twins, a major focus of genetic research in the 1930s. Before the war, researchers like Verschuer studied twins to understand the hereditary basis of diseases, always with the consent of the twins or their parents. However, recruiting twins for these studies was challenging. At Auschwitz, Mengele collected hundreds of pairs of twins from arriving Jewish transports and the Roma. This provided an unprecedented number of twins for his experiments, unlike anything researchers had access to before. Mengele was meticulous in his experiments with twins at Auschwitz, ordering his staff to measure and record every aspect of their bodies. He frequently drew large amounts of blood from the twins and subjected them to other painful procedures. One of the twins, Renate Gutmann, was assigned the number #70917. She was separated from her brother and mother and taken to a hospital within the camp, where she underwent measurements, X-rays, and had blood drawn from her neck. On one occasion, she was strapped to a table and cut with a knife. Another Holocaust survivor, Laurent Menache, recounted that they were given injections throughout their bodies, which caused severe reactions. His sister suffered from a significant infection that led to her neck swelling. She was operated on in the camp hospital under primitive conditions and without anesthetic. The experiments carried out by Mengele on twins included the unnecessary amputation of limbs, infecting one twin with typhus or another disease, and transfusing blood from one twin to another. One particularly gruesome experiment involved Mengele sewing two Romani twins together, back to back, in an attempt to create conjoined twins. This barbaric procedure resulted in both children dying from gangrene after several days of immense suffering. Many victims died as a result of these brutal experiments, and those who survived were sometimes killed and dissected, once Mengele deemed them no longer useful for his research. Miklos Nicely, a prisoner doctor at Auschwitz, recounted a horrifying incident where Mengele personally killed 14 twins in one night by injecting chloroform directly into their hearts. If one twin died from a disease, Mengele would kill the other to enable comparative post-mortem studies. He would then send some of their organs to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin for further analysis. During his selections of arriving Jews on the ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mengele also sought out individuals with physical abnormalities, such as dwarfs, people with gigantism, or those with a clubfoot. His experiments on these people involved taking measurements, drawing blood, extracting healthy teeth, and administering unnecessary drugs and X-rays. After completing his studies, Mengele had these individuals murdered, and their bodies were sent to Germany for research purposes. Elisabeth Ovitz, a dwarf who survived Mengele's experiments, later described the unbearable pain they endured, which continued long after the experiments had stopped. Mengele was also interested in individuals with heterochromia, a condition where a person has differently colored eyes. One of Mengele's colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was particularly focused on this condition. Mengele killed individuals with heterochromia to remove their eyes for study in Berlin. Additionally, he kept hundreds of human eyes pinned to his lab wall, which he disturbingly referred to as a collection of butterflies. Many of Mengele's experiments were conducted on children. He manipulated his young victims with a facade of kindness, providing them with better conditions than other prisoners. They lived in separate barracks and received improved food and care. Moshe Offer, who survived these experiments, shared his memories. Mengele would come to us pretending to be a kind uncle, offering chocolates. Before he began his procedures, he would reassure us, saying, "Don't be afraid, nothing is going to happen to you." He then performed painful experiments, like injecting chemicals and conducting surgery on my brother Tibi's spine. Mengele would give us small gifts after some of these sessions. During later experiments, he inserted pins into our heads, leaving scars that are visible to this day. One time he took my brother away for several days. When Tibi returned, his head was wrapped in bandages. He died in my arms not long after. In his pursuit of medical research for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Mengele also conducted experiments to change the eye color of children by injecting chemicals into their eyes, which sometimes resulted in irritation, blindness, or death. Dr. Gisela Perl, another witness, recounted a horrifying moment after one of Mengele's killings. He pulled out some perfume soap, and while whistling happily and with a satisfied smile, he casually washed his hands. This anecdote highlights Mengele's chilling detachment and the ease with which he committed these atrocities. A prisoner assigned to care for Jewish twins selected for Mengele's experiments at Auschwitz shared harrowing details about the children's reactions to their treatment. Initially, blood samples were taken from the fingers and later directly from the arteries, often multiple times from the same victims. The children would scream and try to shield themselves to avoid being touched, forcing the personnel to restrain them. Eye drops were administered to some of the twins. Some received drops in both eyes, others just one. The effects were agonizing. The children suffered from severe eyelid swelling and a painful burning sensation. Those who survived, stories from the shadows of Auschwitz. Holocaust survivor Alex Dekel recounted witnessing Mengele perform surgeries without anesthesia, during which he removed victims' hearts and stomachs. Yitzhak Ganon, a Jewish survivor from northern Greece who was deported to Auschwitz at the age of 20, revealed in 2009 a chilling account of how Mengele removed one of his kidneys without any anesthesia. After the excruciating procedure, Ganon was sent back to work immediately without any pain relief. Mengele's brutality extended to pregnant women as well. He conducted experiments on them before sending many to their deaths in the gas chambers, demonstrating a complete disregard for human life and suffering. Czech Holocaust survivor Ruth Elias, who was pregnant when she arrived at Auschwitz from the Theresienstadt ghetto, recounted a harrowing experience involving her newborn daughter. "I delivered a beautiful big blonde girl, but Mengele ordered that my breast be bound to see how long a newborn baby can survive without food. After enduring several days of watching her baby suffer, a compassionate Czech doctor provided Elias with a syringe containing an overdose of morphine, allowing her to end her child's suffering." Dr. Olga Lengyel, another survivor of Auschwitz, shared a disturbing memory of Mengele's actions after a childbirth. She noted that although Mengele initially supervised the birth with what seemed like meticulous care, he sent both the mother and the newborn to the gas chamber within an hour of the delivery. In another brutal incident, Mengele forcefully removed an infant from its mother's womb, expecting twins. Upon realizing the child was not a twin, he callously threw the baby into an oven. These accounts illustrate the extreme cruelty and inhumanity that characterized Mengele's experiments and actions at Auschwitz. The elusive escape, Mengele's life on the run. By 1956, Mengele had settled comfortably in Argentina, where he felt secure enough to obtain Argentine citizenship under the name José Mengele. However, in 1959, he discovered that West German prosecutors were aware of his location and were seeking his arrest. Consequently, Mengele moved to Paraguay and acquired citizenship there. In May 1960, following the abduction of Adolf Eichmann by Israeli intelligence agents in Argentina and his subsequent trial in Israel, Mengele surmised that he might also be a target. Anticipating further pursuit, he fled Paraguay. With financial support from his family in Germany, he lived the remainder of his life under the alias Wolfgang Gerhard near Sao Paulo, Brazil. When his son Rolf visited him in 1977, he encountered an unrepentant Nazi. Mengele claimed that he had never personally harmed anyone and had merely performed his duties as an officer. On February 7, 1979, Mengele, then 67, suffered a stroke and drowned while swimming at a vacation resort near Bertioga, Brazil. He was buried in a São Paulo suburb under his assumed name. Mengele, one of the most notorious Nazi doctors and a profoundly infamous figure of the Holocaust, managed to evade capture for 34 years, ultimately escaping justice. No one mourned his death. Deadly Nazi pursuits, secrets of inhuman research. While Mengele managed to avoid capture and lived in hiding, the cruel ideas he followed were also driving another terrible program, Action T4. Action T4 was also known as Nazi Euthanasia Program, and SS Oberfuhrer Victor was a key figure in it. The program led to the deaths of around 300,000 people. These individuals, viewed by the Nazis as either mentally or physically beyond aid, were killed in what they misleadingly termed mercy deaths. Seen as defective and burdensome to society, their lives were cruelly ended under this program. In 1942, Victor Brack wrote a letter to Heinrich Himmler, the architect behind the Holocaust and a plan to exterminate Jews, known as the final solution to the Jewish question. This plan resulted in the deaths, forced labor, and horrific medical experiments on millions of Jews. In his letter, Brack noted that among the approximately 10 million Jews in Europe, 3 million were capable of working. Given the labor shortages at the time, he argued that these Jews should be spared temporarily, but prevented from having children, suggesting harsh methods of sterilization to ensure this. One horrifying Nazi experiment was called warming up after freezing to the danger point. The researcher, Dr. Sigmund Rascher, would chill prisoners to near death to test different rewarming techniques. These methods were intended for use on German soldiers who suffered from hypothermia. In his chilling notes, Rascher documented the time it took for the subjects to die, with entries like Subject 115763, naked, time of death, 64 minutes. Subject 115306, clothed, time of death, 102 minutes. He acknowledged in another report that all subjects died without any revival success. In a particularly brutal series of experiments at Ravensbr&uuml camp, at least 8 women were subjected to what was referred to as animal warmth experiments, where the method of rewarming included forced sexual acts. Rascher also conducted high-altitude experiments, placing mostly Polish and Russian prisoners in a chamber that simulated the conditions of parachuting from a plane without oxygen. His reports coldly noted, only continuous experiments at altitudes higher than 10.5 kilometers resulted in death, with breathing ceasing after about 30 minutes. During these trials, victims exhibited extreme distress under low-pressure conditions, displaying behaviors like pulling out their hair, scratching their faces, and beating their heads against walls until they lost consciousness. Those who survived often suffered severe brain damage, leading to long-term mental impairments. In the disturbing blood coagulation experiments, the Nazis tested a new drug, Polygal-10, which they hoped would speed up blood clotting on the battlefield. Prisoners were given the drug and then grievously wounded by being shot in the neck or chest, or through procedures like amputations, to see how effectively the drug could stop bleeding. Despite some reports stating that the drug reduced bleeding significantly, one document remarked, it was absolutely evident how little the tissues bled. The human cost was catastrophic. Many died as a direct result of the experiments, with official records candidly stating experiments on human beings were carried out and death followed as a natural result of the use of the polygal drugs. The cruelty extended further. Over 2,000 prisoners, including many Polish Roman Catholic priests, were deliberately infected with malaria. Around 450 succumbed, often due to the lethal side effects of the drugs antipyrine and pyrimidon, used purportedly for treatment. Many other prisoners were also subjected to unnecessary surgical procedures without anesthesia, involving invasive operations on various body organs like the stomach, gallbladder, thyroid, lungs, appendix, kidneys, urinary tract, and nervous system. Ravensbr&uuml, the epicenter of unimaginable suffering. Let's focus now on the harrowing experiences at Ravensbrück concentration camp. One notable victim was Władysława Karolewska, a former Polish schoolteacher who recounted her ordeal. She was selected from a lineup at a time typically reserved for executions, recalling the terrifying expectation of death as she had seen other girls shot previously. However, Instead of being executed, Karolewska was taken to a room and sedated. Dr. Fritz Ernst Fischer led these operations, assisted by Dr. Szydlowski and Dr. Rosenthal, whose eventual fates are revealed later. When she regained consciousness, Karolewska found her leg heavily bandaged and in excruciating pain. She described an increasing pain and fever, and the next day noticed a discharge leaking from her leg. In a subsequent procedure, Dr. Fischer covered her head with a sheet before operating, but this time she was not made unconscious. Many women, subjected to similar experiments, eventually found themselves unable to walk, suffering constant pain. Yet they were repeatedly sent back for more surgeries. The stated goal of these experiments was to study bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration, and to explore the viability of transplanting limbs and bones from one person to another. At Ravensbr&uuml, estimates suggest there were around 40,000 Polish prisoners and 26,000 Jewish prisoners, with approximately 28,000 succumbing to overwork, starvation, beatings, and medical experiments. In total, the camp held about 130,000 prisoners from various nationalities, with nearly 50,000 reported dead. Moving to the central focus of today's discussion on the Nazis' experimentation with infections, it's known that infections are among the most lethal complications for soldiers with battlefield injuries. This prompted the Nazis to deliberately infect prisoners in the camps as part of their cruel experiments. A notorious figure in this context was Karl Gebhardt, the Third Reich's chief surgeon. He orchestrated numerous medical atrocities at both the Ravensbr&uuml and Auschwitz camps. Gebhardt was infamous for conducting surgeries without anesthesia, performing unnecessary transplants, and infecting so-called rabbits, a derogatory term used for test subjects, with substances that caused severe infections. Post-war testimonies shed light on these heinous acts, with one stating, "The criminal experiments consisted in the deliberate cutting out and infection of bones and muscles of the legs with virulent bacteria, the cutting out of nerves, the introducing into the tissues of virulent substances, and the causing of artificial bone fractures." These experiments represent some of the darkest abuses of medical science during the war. Some of the Nazi experiments involved sulfur drugs, also known as sulfonamides, which are used to treat bacterial infections. The impetus for these experiments traces back to a specific incident involving a high-ranking SS officer, Reinhard Heydrich, who was severely injured in a car bombing in 1942. Adolf Hitler, deeply upset by the attack on his close associate, was further infuriated when Heydrich succumbed to sepsis following serious injuries, including facial shrapnel wounds and damage to his lungs and spleen. Himmler's personal physician at the time, Gebhardt, chose not to treat Heydrich with sulfur drugs, a decision that drew severe criticism from Hitler. In defense, Gebhardt claimed that sulfur drugs would not have saved Heydrich. Determined to prove his point, Gebhardt carried out experiments on Polish prisoners held in the camps. These prisoners were not chosen because they were already injured. Rather, they were among the healthiest individuals available. Gebhardt deliberately inflicted wounds on them to then attempt treatment with sulfur drugs, testing their efficacy under controlled yet ethically reprehensible conditions. Sulfur drugs, advancements in battlefield treatments. Karl Gebhardt initially tested his experiments using sulfur drugs on male prisoners at Sachsenhausen camp, located about an hour's drive from Ravensbr&uuml. However, these prisoners proved difficult to manage. The experiments were conducted by Dr. Fritz Ernst Fischer, but under Gebhardt's direct orders. During Fischer's trial, he detailed the procedure in his affidavit, describing how an incision was made on the lower leg to introduce bacterial cultures mixed with dextrose into the wound, which was then sewn shut. Contrary to their intentions, these procedures did not result in serious illnesses or infections. Due to the lack of success in infecting the male prisoners, the focus shifted to approximately 60 Polish women at Ravensbr&uuml. The methodology was brutally straightforward. The doctors would cut open the body, implant bacterial cultures along with foreign objects such as glass, cloth fibers, wood shavings, and dirt, and then sew the wound closed. The intention was to create a severe infection by mimicking battlefield injuries. Glass fragments were specifically used to simulate the crust of dirt typically found in such wounds and to hasten the infection process. The bacterial cultures used in the experiments were a lethal mix of Staphylococci, Streptococci, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium novii, known to cause deadly conditions like gas gangrene or tetanus. The women subjected to these experiments suffered excruciating pain and were left in the dark about what had been done to them. Many developed severe fevers as the infections took hold. In a cruel twist, the doctors treated some of the women with sulfonylamides, while deliberately withholding medication from others to observe the differences. This was likely a response to Hitler's earlier criticisms, and Gebhardt probably felt a sense of vindication seeing the drugs fail to improve the conditions of those treated. The infections continued to devastate their bodies. SS Chief Medical Officer Professor Ernst Robert Grawitz, known for his harsh views and previous promises to eradicate the perverted world of the homosexual, oversaw some of these experiments. Dismissively, he regarded the suffering and outcomes as a waste of time, critiquing that they failed to replicate actual battlefield conditions. If they had, he argued, the women would already be dead. These experiments were repeated mercilessly on the same group of women, some undergoing the same brutal procedures up to 8 times. Barbara Pietzig, only 16 at the time and the youngest of the so-called rabbits, was operated on 5 times in 1942, resulting in paralysis of her left lower limb. She survived the war but tragically died in 1947 due to complications from the experiments. Echoes of survival, tales from Auschwitz's witnesses. Survivors later recounted that the Nazis would execute women who they felt no longer served any purpose, highlighting the utter disregard for human life. Despite their suffering, these women formed close bonds, supporting one another through unimaginable horrors. A historian described how the women in the camp would prepare each other for execution with care and solidarity, doing their best to provide comfort in their final moments. They would pinch each other's cheeks to add color, style their hair, and make themselves look as beautiful as possible for their last walk. Professor Grawitz decided to escalate the experiments to more closely mimic battlefield conditions by proposing that the women be shot before treatment with sulfur drugs was attempted. This change was based on the rationale that bullet wounds typically cause severe tissue damage and disrupt normal blood circulation, creating an ideal environment for bacterial growth due to the lack of blood flow necessary for tissue defense. Following this new protocol, Gebhardt performed an experiment where he tied off the muscles of 24 Polish female prisoners to cut off blood circulation, leading to tissue death or necrosis. He then introduced bacteria directly into the wounds. 5 women died from severe infections, which the doctors considered a great success in their twisted criteria, as it mimicked battlefield conditions more closely than previous methods. In these cruel tests, some women were treated with sulfonilamide in various forms, powder rubbed into the wounds, oral powders and tablets. Others were given injections of the drug. Meanwhile, some women received no treatment at all, left to suffer or die as part of the experiment. The effects were devastating, with many developing severe abscesses and systemic infections that threatened their lives. A report from the National Institutes of Health highlights the appalling post-operative care provided to the women involved in these experiments. Many received no pain relief whatsoever, and their wound dressings were rarely, if ever, changed properly. As mentioned earlier, some women were even shot to silence them, a grim testament to the Nazis' awareness of the unethical nature of their actions. Despite the severe conditions and attempts to silence them, some survivors were able to testify about their experiences. Notable among them were Maria Broel-Plata, Jadwiga Zido, Władysława Karolewska, and Maria Kuzmiarczuk, who all gave evidence during the doctor's trial. Dr. Zofia Maxka, another prisoner, testified that many women could have been saved if the infected areas had been amputated in time. When questioned why he did not choose amputation to save the women, Gebhardt's response highlighted his disregard for their lives. He argued that the infections were too widespread for amputation to be effective, a claim that sidestepped the potential for earlier, life-saving interventions. Gebhardt was well aware that sulfur drugs were ineffective against gangrene, a fact known from unsuccessful attempts by American and British doctors. Ultimately, the Nazis viewed these women as expendable, much like the animals used globally for medical experiments. Tragically, even those who survived the gangrene experiments were not spared further suffering. They were often subjected to additional brutal experiments aimed at studying bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. The Nazis conducted extremely risky and inhumane experiments, attempting to transplant bones and even entire limbs from one woman to another. For instance, parts of the tibia or fibula, the bones from the lower leg, were harvested and transplanted into another woman's leg. The doctors were aware of the high risk of sepsis from such operations, but proceeded regardless, ignoring the grave dangers involved. A Czech doctor, Dr. Zdenka Nedvedova-Nejedla, who was forced to work in the camp, provided a harrowing account in her affidavit. She detailed how extreme amputations, including entire arms with the shoulder blade or legs, were performed predominantly on women deemed insane, who were then quickly killed post-operation with an injection of Evipan. She noted the lack of any post-operative care, highlighting that it was forbidden even to administer sedatives to alleviate intense pain after the surgery. According to her testimony, 11 women died as a direct result of these barbaric experiments. Further testimonies from survivors provide a chilling insight into the brutal reality of these experiments. One woman recalled the terrifying approach of Dr. Rosenthal, remembering how she looked at the sky, thinking it might be her last view before receiving an injection that led to intense pain and paralysis upon awakening. Another testimony described the constant screams from the torture chamber, where no painkillers were provided to the women to ensure the experiments were not affected. In a stark contrast underscoring the cruelty of the experiments, it was mentioned that even dogs subjected to similar procedures received strong doses of morphine for 5 days. Tragically, a young girl, only 17, was among those who died from complications of the experiments, suffering from severe swelling and infection. In a chilling testimony, it was revealed that in order to conduct more detailed research, the Nazis removed entire hips, shoulder joints, or even the whole arm including the shoulder blade from some women. These body parts were then wrapped in sheets and transported by car by the professors and their assistants, including well-known doctors like Grawitz, Kogel, and Schultz. Tragically, the women from whom these parts were taken were killed immediately after surgery by injection. Facing justice, the doctor's trial, and the pursuit of accountability. Karl Gebhardt was one of 23 men tried at the doctor's trial, which was part of a series of 12 trials held from December 9, 1946 to August 20, 1947. During these trials, 7 men were sentenced to death, 7 were acquitted, and the rest received various prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. Gebhardt was executed by hanging on June 2, 1948. Fritz Ernst Fischer, after being released from prison in 1954, surprisingly went on to have a successful career at a chemical company, living until the age of 90, dying in 2003. Victor Brack, another key figure in the experiments, was also executed in 1948. He maintained until his death that his actions were humane. Before his execution, he expressed a wish for peace to the world. When Ernst Robert Grawitz realized the Red Army was closing in, he chose to end his life and that of his family with a grenade, avoiding capture and the consequences of his actions. Other doctors involved at Ravensbr&uuml, like Herta Oberhäuser, served only 4 years in prison. Dr. Rolf Rosenthal and Gerhard Schiedlowski were tried and executed by the British in May 1947 at the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials. In an unusual twist, 21 of the accused in this trial were women, primarily guards or nurses, raising questions about their level of involvement and responsibility in the atrocities. A prisoner named Helena Esther Goldsmith testified that the German nurses were indifferent and even sarcastic towards the suffering of the sick, never making any effort to help them, even when they could have. At Ravensbrück concentration camp, there were usually 6 nurses and 3 female doctors, Herta Oberhäuser, Erika Janssen, and Gerda Weyand. While Janssen and Weyand did not stand trial, Oberhäuser served only 4 years in prison. However, involvement in severe abuses did lead to harsher consequences for some women at the camp. Vera Salvaquart, a nurse who had been interned in a German camp herself during the war for refusing to betray her Jewish partner, was hanged in England. Despite having helped prisoners escape and having saved women and children by switching their identification numbers with those of the deceased, she was executed. Salvaquart had even spied for the British at one point, but her previous actions were not enough to save her. Greta Bosel, the work input overseer and a nurse at Ravensbr&uuml, was also executed. She was accused of leading prisoners on a deadly march and selecting prisoners for execution at Uckermark camp. Her execution occurred shortly after that of Elizabeth Marshall, the head nurse who was said to have overseen many of the cruel experiments and selections for execution. Dorothea Binns, a feared guard, was notorious for her brutality, often targeting the weakest women to whip, stomp, and beat without provocation. She roamed the camp with a whip and a German shepherd, taking pleasure in the violence. Binns and her boyfriend, also a guard, would watch the atrocities with enjoyment. She was hanged by the British on May 2, 1947. Carmen Maury, another guard known for her sadomasochistic and psychopathic behavior, died shortly before her scheduled execution. Despite having worked as a spy for the Allies and narrowly avoiding a previous death sentence due to intervention, she could not escape her eventual fate. Emma Zimmer, renowned for her sadistic pleasure in tormenting prisoners, and Ida Schreiter, who selected women for execution, were both executed on September 20, 1948. In total, 17 people were executed following the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials. 2 died during the trial, and 1 was reprieved. Buchenwald, another chapter in the horrors of the Holocaust. 150 miles from the Ravensbrück concentration camp, there was the Buchenwald concentration camp. Buchenwald was established in July 1937 and was one of the earliest large-scale concentration camps. Initially, its prisoners were mostly communists or those suspected of being communists. As World War II progressed, the camp's population grew to include Poles, Slavs, Jews, Roma, mentally ill, disabled, homosexual, and other political prisoners. Buchenwald was infamous for its harsh conditions and severe food shortages, which contributed to the deaths of about 60,000 of the 280,000 prisoners housed there or in any of its 139 subcamps. The camp also had a notorious reputation due to the summary executions that took place. Interestingly, there was only one set of barracks designated for the 500 to 1,000 women sent to Buchenwald, some of whom were forced into sexual slavery by the Nazis. Though part of the camp functioned as a brothel, the primary purpose of Buchenwald was economic exploitation. Private German companies paid the SS minimal wages to use the prisoners as labor, often in armaments production. It's important to note that it was rare for Western POWs to be sent to Nazi concentration camps. They were typically held in one of Germany's 1,000 prisoner-of-war camps, which adhered more closely to the Geneva Convention rules regarding food, labor, and rest. Conditions in these POW camps were tough, but generally followed international standards set in 1929. An exceptional case occurred when 169 Allied airmen were sent to Buchenwald. This was a highly unusual situation, and thankfully, only 2 of these mostly American, British, and Canadian soldiers died during the 3 months they were held there. Despite suffering from hunger, thirst, and beatings, as recalled by the late Retrod, to Lieutenant Russell Hilding, who passed away only in 2021, these airmen did not endure the worst of what the camp had to offer. In contrast, Soviet POWs were treated with extraordinary brutality, as the Germans did not apply the Geneva Convention or any other standards to their treatment. Buchenwald held a significant number of homosexual prisoners. At that time, homosexuality was illegal in Germany under paragraph 175, which the Nazis had modified to harshly criticize homosexual relationships. Approximately 7,000 men were convicted for homosexuality during the Nazi regime. These men faced a grim choice: undergo re-education to change their innate sexual orientation, or be sent to the front lines or concentration camps like Buchenwald. Block 46, the illusory sanctuary of survival and suffering in Auschwitz. In 1943, Heinrich Himmler, known as the architect of the Holocaust, decreed that all incorrigible homosexual offenders should be sent to concentration camps. Once at Buchenwald, many of these prisoners were taken to a section misleadingly named the Division for Typhus and Virus Research of the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS. Here, they were deliberately infected with typhus and other viruses as part of Nazi medical experiments. This area, known as Block 46, was designed to look like a hospital but was isolated from the rest of the camp by barbed wire. The experiments were overseen by the chief physician under the direction of Joachim Mrugowski, a prominent German bacteriologist and head of the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS. The experiments weren't limited to typhus. Prisoners at Buchenwald were also exposed to pathogens causing erysipelas, a severe skin infection, scarlet fever, and paratyphoid diarrhea. These experiments were part of a collaboration between the Nazis and pharmaceutical companies, aiming to advance vaccine technology to benefit soldiers on the front lines. In addition to other forms of abuse, homosexuals, Soviets, criminals, and political prisoners at Buchenwald were subjected to disease infections as part of the Nazis' experiments to test experimental vaccines. These experiments would have violated the Nuremberg Code, had it existed at the time. Ironically, the code was established in response to such atrocities. Block 46, where these experiments occurred, initially seemed like a sanctuary to the prisoners. Inside, there were 4 spacious rooms with spotless floors and actual beds instead of bunks, housed within what appeared to be a modern clinic. This was a stark contrast to the deplorable living conditions they had endured. According to the Journal of Survivor Robert Waits, the linen was clean, adorned with pretty blue and white checkered coverlets and pillowcases, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a monastery. The nurses appeared kind, and the staff, also prisoners, enjoyed several benefits. The food was notably better and more varied than standard camp rations, including milk, butter, white bread, eggs, marmalade or artificial honey, sugar, and either sweetened porridge or a milk noodle soup. To the prisoners, it initially seemed like they had struck gold. However, the grim reality was that many were about to be injected with typhus as part of the experiments. Some prisoners, already sick with typhus, volunteered for these experiments, hoping the improved living conditions would last if they survived. But for many others, including the incorrigible criminals, Russians, homosexuals, and political prisoners, participation was not a choice. Thus, Block 46 served a dual purpose. It was both a treatment center for those who had contracted typhus naturally and a research facility for the deliberate infection of human subjects. Regardless of how they arrived at Block 46, all prisoners were in peril, their lives in the hands of Dr. Erwin Ding-Schuler, the lead physician at the camp and a key figure at the Hygiene Institute under Joachim Mrugowski. From January 1942 to March 1945, Dr. Erwin Ding-Schuler led a series of experiments at Buchenwald involving potential typhus vaccines. A total of 988 prisoners participated in these experiments, with 1/4 dying and the remainder suffering severe injuries. One report on a specific typhus experiment noted that 9 out of 10 prisoners injected intravenously died, primarily from encephalitis or cardiovascular collapse, while only 1 of 4 injected subcutaneously succumbed. Working alongside Ding-Schuler were several others: Waldemar Hoven, the camp doctor, Arthur Dietsch, the head prisoner nurse in the typhus ward, and Jürgen Kogon, Ding-Schuler's medical clerk, a camp survivor, and later a historian. Kogon, who had been arrested by the Gestapo in 1936 for his anti-Nazi activities, documented much of what transpired in the camp. He observed many deaths from the experiments, but also noted occasions when Ding-Schuler intervened to save prisoners' lives. Kogon himself managed to save some prisoners by swapping their names with those who had already died from typhus. He and Dietsch later discovered that they were also marked for extermination once the experiments concluded. Collaboration and deadly medicine, the pharmaceutical connection. The horrors of Buchenwald extended beyond biological experiments. The camp was also part of the Nazis' chemical warfare program. Pharmaceutical companies funded SS experiments with neurotoxic substances like tabun and sarin. Additionally, poisons from the alkaloid group were tested on at least 4 Soviet soldiers to observe their effects. During the doctors' trials after the war, it was revealed that when these poisons did not result in death, the men were strangled, taken to the crematorium, and dissected. Another gruesome aspect of the experimentation involved inducing severe phosphorus burns on some prisoners. This was done to test experimental treatments and better understand how to manage such injuries on the battlefield. In the early stages of their experimentation at Buchenwald, the Nazis secretly mixed various poisons into the prisoners' food. According to trial testimonies, these poisons caused instant death, and the victims' bodies were then autopsied to gather valuable information. There were also allegations of prisoners being shot with poisoned bullets in September 1944, though details about these incidents remain scarce, with only testimonial evidence to confirm that they occurred. A touching moment in the aftermath of these atrocities was reported by The Guardian on April 18, 1945. As part of the denazification efforts, American military police escorted 1,000 citizens from Weimar through the scenic countryside to Buchenwald. The intention was to confront the German public with the horrors perpetrated in their name. The visitors were overwhelmed with emotion. Many cried, some vomited, and others fainted upon witnessing the grim reality of the camp. When American forces liberated Buchenwald, they encountered harrowing scenes. The Guardian described finding blackened frames of bodies still in the ovens and 2 piles of emaciated dead in the yard outside, through huts where living skeletons too ill or weak to rise lay packed in 3-tier bunks. At that time, the death rate in the camp was about 40 men per day. The doctors there bleakly noted which prisoners would likely die soon, with The Guardian summarizing the situation as a stark representation of Nazism's brutal legacy. Overall, an estimated 56,545 people died at Buchenwald, primarily from diseases and starvation. Over 8,000 were executed by gunshot, 1,000 were hanged, and hundreds more succumbed to the results of medical experiments. The survivors, weakened by prolonged malnutrition and subsisting mainly on thin soups, were at risk if fed too quickly. The American liberators learned the hard way that reintroducing food to the starving had to be done cautiously. Early attempts to provide more substantial meals resulted in some prisoners overeating and dying from shock. The liberation and its aftermath were profoundly disturbing for the American soldiers involved. One 23-year-old army sergeant wrote to his sister the day after visiting Buchenwald, expressing his inability to shake the haunting images of the suffering he witnessed. Moved by the dire condition of the survivors, at least 70 US soldiers donated their blood to help those who needed transfusions, a testament to the compassion stirred by the grim sights at the camp. As the American forces provided medical care and support to the survivors of Buchenwald, the psychological trauma experienced by the inmates became starkly evident. One US medic noted that it took anywhere from a week to 3 weeks for many prisoners to comprehend that they were now safe in the care of friends and liberators. Another medic reflected on the profound impact the experience had on him, stating that what truly vanished after witnessing the horrors of Buchenwald was their innocence. The fate of the doctors who participated in the cruel experiments at Buchenwald was a significant point of contention during the post-war trials. Gerhard Rose, a doctor specializing in tropical medicine who was involved in the typhus experiments, defended his actions by claiming that the prisoners were already sentenced to death, suggesting that his experiments did not alter their ultimate fate. His lawyer further argued that American doctors had conducted similar experiments on prisoners in Manila, claiming these prisoners were also sentenced to death. This was meant to draw a parallel to Rose's actions, describing him as a legally appointed executioner. However, testimonies from other witnesses, including Eugen Kogon, refuted this claim, asserting that the prisoners were not sentenced to die, but were merely used as guinea pigs. Ultimately, Gerhard Rose was sentenced to life in prison. Other doctors associated with the Buchenwald experiments faced grim ends as well. While Erwin Ding Schuler took his own life to avoid execution, figures like Joachim Mrugowski and Waldemar Hoven were hanged for their roles in the atrocities committed at the camp.